Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. The White House Chief of Staff is one of the most important jobs in American government. He, and so far it's always been a he, is often the second most powerful person in the country. A new book, The Gatekeepers, is loaded with great stories about the chiefs of the modern era and the presidents they served. It argues persuasively that the effectiveness of the White House Chief of Staff often determines how successful a presidency is. We'll talk about all of this with my guest, the author of The Gatekeepers and a former Peabody and Emmy-award-winning producer at 60 Minutes, Chris Whipple. Chris, welcome. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, you interviewed all 17 living chiefs of staff, plus two presidents in researching this book, which I think is amazing. You opened the book with the description of this extraordinary meeting on a cold December day in Washington back in 2008. Talk about what was going on at that meeting.
Really an incredible scene when you think about it, and almost inconceivable in our current climate of toxic partisanship.
Right.
I mean, all of these, 13 living White House chiefs, ranging from Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld to Leon Panetta and John Podesta, all came to the White House at the invitation of the outgoing chief to give Rahm Emanuel, the incoming chief, advice. And it was...
Emanuel was there for Barack Obama, who's coming in.
That's right. So, but Rahm hadn't begun yet. This was a month before, and it was a cold, especially cold winter morning in Washington, D.C., but Emanuel was chilled by the crisis that he faced because, the world was on the brink of a global depression. Mm-hmm. The auto industry was about to go belly up, and all of these chiefs who had served as, one of them as vice president, several as defense secretary, OMB. The one thing they had in common was that they had served as White House Chief of Staff, this elite fraternity of guys. And as Cheney put it, they came to show Rahm the keys to the men's room. And it was serious, but it was also, there were some great moments. Ken Duberstein, Reagan's final chief, looked at Rahm gravely and said, "Never forget that when you open your mouth, it's not you who's speaking, it's the President of the United States," to which Rahm said, "Oh, blank."
It sounds like Rahm.
They finally got to Cheney, and Cheney looked up over his glasses. And Cheney, of course, was still the quite powerful Vice President of the United States. He looked up at him and said, "At all costs, control your Vice President." And,
that's hilarious.
But the point of it was that they really did come to try to impart some useful advice on how to run the White House.
That's a great line from Cheney. At all costs, control your Vice President. You make it clear how tough this job is. What is it that makes this job so tough?
Well, it's indescribably grueling and 24/7 and thankless. You get all of the blame for everything that goes wrong and none of the credit for anything that goes right. It's Sam Skinner, forgive me, Bill Daley, who was Obama's second chief, said that he came down with the shingles after he left the job. The job description is so, it's hard to overstate the importance of it. I mean, the White House chief is not only famously the gatekeeper who creates time and space for a president to think, but he's also the honest broker of information. He's in charge of teeing up every decision that gets into the Oval Office with information on every side. He's famously the heat shield, taking all the flack. He's the javelin catcher, as Jack Watson once described it, Jimmy Carter's last chief. At the end of the day, he's the guy who is often the only other person in the room when life and death decisions are being made, historic decisions, and he's the guy who tells the president what he doesn't want to hear.
One of the many interesting things in this book is you describe what was really a dramatic change in the personality and demeanor of Dick Cheney from the time when he served, and he was Gerald Ford's chief of staff, and then the time when he comes back and he's vice president. And of course, we had the September 11th attacks early and right at almost at the beginning of the George W. Bush era. So describe that change in demeanor, and why do you think that change occurred?
Yeah, first of all, it's stunning to me, really a mystery that nobody beat me to this book, that nobody had ever done this.
I was going to ask you about that because it's such a window, but go ahead.
And, because think about it. I mean, this is at least my hope is that it's a new look at the last 50 years of presidential history through this prism, through the eyes of the president's closest confidants, the guys who are in the room for the big decisions. And it's also a very human story about all of these incredible personalities. I mean, the cast of characters from Don Rumsfeld to Cheney to Rahm Emanuel. But anyway, think about this for a minute. Don Rumsfeld was Gerald Ford's chief of staff. And he wants to bring in as his deputy this down-and-out character who had flunked out of college twice. He was a ne'er-do-well at one point, if I can use that old expression. He had a drinking problem. One day he woke up face down in a Wyoming jail and decided he'd better change his life. Well, the guy Rumsfeld wanted to hire was Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney had gotten his act together, had gone to grad school, and Rumsfeld took him under his wing, brought him into the Ford White House. Ford just said, if this is the guy you want, it's okay by me. Cheney wound up becoming chief of staff during the last year of the Ford presidency, and believe it or not, Cheney was the most popular guy in town.
Isn't that something?
He was self-effacing. He had this great sense of humor. The press corps loved him. He was the guy you wanted in the room when you needed to reach consensus. So ever since, the chiefs of staffs themselves have been looking at each other saying, what happened to that guy? There are lots of theories. Brent Scowcroft, his old friend who had a falling out over the Iraq War, thought it was his heart condition that changed him. Mm-hmm. Some people thought he went to the dark side as the CEO of Halliburton. Cheney says the world didn't change. I mean, I didn't change, the world changed on 9/11. He just became more serious. But anyway, imagine now, fast forward 30 years later, and Cheney and Rumsfeld are two of the most powerful characters in the Bush White House. And it's in part because they had been chiefs of staff 30 years earlier, and they were the ultimate bureaucratic infighters.
They knew the jobs inside and out.
And poor Andy Card, who was a very competent guy who knew the White House very well.
Andy Card was the chief of staff for George W. Bush.
George W. Bush's White House chief really was out of his depth trying to compete with those guys when it came to the big decision.
There seemed to be general agreement among the people you described in your book that James Baker III, who had been the chief of staff for Ronald Reagan, was among the best, if not the best, of the chiefs in the modern era. Why?
He was, as my friend Susan Zorinsky, the legendary former White House producer, once said, Baker was the guy with the secret sauce. I mean, he was a smooth as silk Texas lawyer, 50 years old when he took the job, had nothing to prove, was able to walk into the Oval Office and close the door behind him and tell Ronald Reagan some hard truths and sometimes turn him around on issues. He was a guy who, Reagan deserves credit for, it was a courageous choice on Reagan's part to choose Baker, because Baker had run the campaign of his arch rival, George H.W. Bush. But Reagan understood something that our current president has not figured out, Donald Trump, and that is that an outsider president needs a consummate insider to really get things done. And Baker knew how the White House ran, and he knew Capitol Hill. He could count votes with the best of them. And he was, I I think everybody's choice is the gold standard.
He also had to deal with a very powerful First Lady in Nancy Reagan, and by all accounts in your book, he did that very well. But there was another big shot in that administration, Donald Reagan, who became chief of staff to Reagan, and he didn't do so well in dealing with Nancy Reagan. Can you talk about that?
Well, you know, okay, so we see a current White House that's dealing with some family issues.
Right.
We've seen this movie before, but, you know, Baker was smart enough to enlist Nancy Reagan as an ally. Nancy Reagan was famously called the personnel director. She had so much influence. Michael Deaver was practically family. He was a deputy chief of staff, and he was practically family, but Baker also enlisted him, and as a result, Baker was able to fend off the hard right ideologues who came after him. Don Regan, not so much. This was the most disastrous job swap in political history. Baker was burned out after 4 years, and one day the Treasury Secretary, Donald Regan, said, "Hey, Jim, why don't we swap jobs?"
Right.
Nancy Reagan's usually infallible antenna completely failed her in this case.
She signed off on this job
She signed
swap.
off on this, as she always did, as the personnel director. It was a disaster. Reagan was a guy who had been a former Merrill Lynch chairman. He was regal and arrogant, and he literally liked to have himself announced when he entered a room. Ladies and gentlemen,
goodness.
the chief of staff to the President of the United States. He immediately ran into trouble when the Iran-Contra scandal hatched in the White House basement, and Reagan failed to stop it. It never, in my opinion, that never would have happened on Jim Baker's watch.
Right.
But the coup de grace with Don Reagan was when he had an argument with Nancy Reagan on the phone.
This cannot be good.
He hung up the phone on Nancy Reagan. And as Jim Baker later said, that's not just a firing offense, that may be a hanging offense. He was gone within a week.
That was it for Don Reagan.
That was it
right?
for Don Reagan.
How did Bill Clinton do? I mean, he's president for 8 years, and that was a tumultuous 8 years politically. How did he do with chiefs?
You know, Clinton's a fascinating case, and I think looking at these presidents through the prism of the White House chiefs, I hope readers are going to learn a lot about these presidents that they didn't know before. Bill Clinton spent almost all of his time picking his cabinet and almost no time picking his White House staff, which is more important to every president. Clinton wound up at the last minute choosing an old friend named Mac McLarty,
Right.
Thomas F. Mac McLarty. He was a very able guy, very smart. But he was an old friend of Clinton's. It's hard for friends to tell presidents what they don't want to hear,
Right.
especially with someone like Clinton, who's famously undisciplined. And Clinton thought he could, kind of like Jimmy Carter, I think Clinton thought he could run the White House himself. And that was a big mistake. And so a year and a half in, there was almost an intervention by, among others, Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, Bob Reich, this Labor Secretary. They went to Clinton and convinced him he needed to change things, and he brought in Leon Panetta.
Because things were not going well at all. There had been the healthcare debacle and a number of other problems.
I mean, Clinton was really pretty much dead in the water.
Yeah.
He couldn't get traction on any of his real agenda. Remember Whitewater and Travelgate and
Yep.
all of these scandals. He brought in Leon Panetta, practically kidnapped Panetta and took him to Camp David, locked him in a cabin. And
Because Panetta didn't want the job.
Panetta loved being OMB director, and he wanted to continue. And Clinton, as Panetta told me the story, he was in a cabin with Clinton, Hillary, Al Gore, and Tipper. He said, "I knew it wasn't going to be a fair fight." And Clinton said, "Leon, you could be the greatest OMB director in history, and if the White House is broken, nobody's going to remember you."
Which is true.
That was it. That
Was that
enough.
the selling point?
And Panetta agreed to do it, and Panetta became, in my opinion, next to Jim Baker, I would say one of the most effective chiefs in history. I think he, with help from Erskine Bowles, who was his deputy, I think they really turned the Clinton White House around.
Now, Bowles became subsequently chief of staff. He followed Panetta. Clinton is still president. But the Monica Lewinsky scandal occurred and talk about Clinton, the scandal, and Erskine Bowles.
You know, this was a very painful episode for Erskine Bowles, who was very friendly with Clinton. I mean, he never lost sight of the fact that he served Clinton. I don't think the friendship got in the way of Bowles being a very effective White House chief. But I think he was personally really hurt by the Lewinsky affair, because Clinton wasn't telling the truth, even to his staff and his White House chiefs. And I think that was tough for Bowles. And at one point, as I describe in the book, there's a moment where the subject of the Lewinsky scandal comes up, and Bowles gets sick to his stomach and bolts from the room and never comes back.
Wow.
That's how painful it was for him. Podesta, I think John Podesta was put in charge. He was the deputy chief, and Podesta was put in charge of the scandal, and I think handled it very well. But it was painful for Erskine Bowles.
Now, if we could go back a few years, one of the most significant chiefs was Bob Haldeman, all the way back in the Richard Nixon administration. What was so significant about Haldeman?
Haldeman's fascinating, complex character. I mean, the cartoon character of Haldeman that we all remember is the guy who was the poster boy for Watergate. He was the so-called Berlin Wall,
right,
who isolated Nixon and was to blame for Watergate. Not true, really. I mean, Haldeman. The irony here is that all of Haldeman's successors, and most of them, credit him with creating the template for the modern White House chief of staff.
Right.
He was the ultimate gatekeeper. He actually created time and space for Nixon to think. He ran a very tight ship. He was able to, control the information flow to Nixon. He was a very effective White House chief. His fatal flaw was that when Watergate took place, he wasn't able to speak truth to power to Nixon and to shut it down. And he later said in 1986, long after he'd gone to prison for obstruction of justice in the affair, he said, the problem was that the system he created,
right,
he said the system wasn't followed. And had it been followed, Watergate wouldn't have happened. Well, the system, I think he meant by that the chief needs to speak hard truths to Nixon.
And was he just, you don't think of Haldeman as being intimidated by anyone, but was he, at the end, intimidated by Richard Nixon, that he just couldn't bring himself to say,
Yeah.
Mr. President, this is what's going on, we have to shut it down?
Evidently he was. It's a mystery with Haldeman because, he was a very effective chief, and he was a guy you would think would be able to speak hard truths. I had a fascinating conversation with Rumsfeld about this, Donald Rumsfeld, who was in the Nixon administration and had a bird's eye view. And I said to him, "What about Haldeman? How could this have happened?" And he said, "I think Haldeman was dutiful. Haldeman, I'm not sure Haldeman ever told Nixon no. He was dutiful. I was less so."
I was less so. He was indeed. You mentioned Rahm Emanuel. How did he do? Rahm wasn't chief of staff that long with Barack Obama, but he was there at that critical early period when everything in terms of the economy was falling apart. How did he do as chief of staff?
Well, one of the funny stories about Rahm and how he got the job is that before Obama won the election, when it was clear he was going to win, he quietly had a meeting with his closest staff, who were all from, many of them from Chicago, in a hotel room in Reno, Nevada. He brought in Clinton's ex-White House chiefs, and Erskine Bowles was there, and the subject was who should be Obama's first White House chief. And Bowles immediately said, "Leave your Chicago friends at home." Of course, the room's full of Chicago friends.
Right.
Anyway, he obviously didn't follow that piece of advice. It was a time of real crisis with the world on the verge of possibly a Great Depression and the auto industry about to go belly up. I think Obama felt that he needed someone who knew Capitol Hill, who could get a lot of stuff passed in a hurry. The stimulus, among other things, which Emanuel was able to do. There's a great story in the book about Rahm when he was Clinton's senior advisor, and he was famously aggressive. And he would constantly get in trouble, pissing off one of Clinton's allies on the Hill, And Clinton tried to fire him, not once or twice, but multiple times.
Bill Clinton wanted to fire Rahm Emanuel.
Bill Clinton would say to Erskine Bowles, his chief of staff, "You need to fire Rahm. He's trouble." And Bowles would ignore him and come back. And finally, he said to the president, "You know why we don't fire him, Mr. President? Because every time you come out of that office with something that we can't get the bureaucracy to do, we give it to Rahm, and 2 days later, it's done.
It's done.
There might be 10 bodies on the floor, but it's done."
He may tick a lot of people off, but...
So Rahm is a guy who got stuff done.
So let's look at the present day. Donald Trump's administration appears to be chaotic for a lot of reasons. Reince Priebus is the chief of staff, but we don't hear his name very often. How do you view what's going on there, and especially in terms of the chief of staff situation?
You know, one way to think about it is the Trump White House reminds me of a kid's soccer game where nobody knows how to play their position. So every kid is running straight to the ball.
Right.
There are no lines of authority. It's not clear who is in charge, if anyone. And that's the fundamental problem. I mean, every modern president learns, often the hard way, that you cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House chief of staff as first among equals in the White House to execute your agenda and to tell you what you don't want to hear. And right now, this is the most dysfunctional White House in modern history.
And then you make it clear in the book, you just say flat out that Donald Trump is the least qualified person ever to ascend to the presidency. I would agree with you. There are other people who would not agree. Can you be a little more specific about why you feel that is the case?
Well, you know, people might disagree about how qualified or unqualified Trump may be. What's clear to me, and what the last 50 years of presidential history make really clear to me, is that governing is tough. You know, governing has nothing to do or little to do with running a Manhattan real estate firm, a family real estate firm. You cannot govern effectively in the White House, and the proof is just there if you look at history, with 5 or 6 senior advisors, all of them equal access to the Oval, coming and going, with nobody clearly first among equals. Jerry Ford, who succeeded Nixon, famously as the accidental president when Nixon resigned. Jerry Ford tried this. He had 5 or 6 advisors, equal access. He called it the spokes of the wheel.
Right.
It was a disaster. Within a month, Jerry Ford realized it was chaos, it was dysfunction, and he reached out to, guess who? Donald Rumsfeld, to come in and whip his White House into shape.
And Rumsfeld did.
And Rumsfeld did.
The book is called The Gatekeepers. It's wonderful. Chris Whipple, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. New York City is what is known as a sanctuary city, which means it has restrictions on the degree to which its officials can cooperate with federal immigration authorities. The idea is to protect law-abiding individuals from unjust deportation and to encourage them to cooperate with local authorities if they become the victim of a crime or have knowledge of criminal behavior. If, for example, a woman who is undocumented calls the police to say that she has been attacked by a husband or a boyfriend, or if she's otherwise assaulted or possibly raped, the authorities in New York City would not give information about her immigration status to the feds. That policy in New York and other sanctuary cities around the country infuriates President Donald Trump, his Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly, and his Attorney General Jeff Sessions. They have vowed to punish sanctuary cities by cutting off the flow of federal law enforcement grants. Justice Department officials recently became so upset they seemed to lose their grip on reality. They issued a statement that ranted wildly and inaccurately about spiraling crime and violence in sanctuary cities. Some of those cities are supposedly crumbling under the weight of illegal immigration and violence. New York, the department said, continues to see gang murder after gang murder, the predictable consequence of the city's soft on crime stance. All right, a reality check, please. In 1990, there were 2,245 murders in the city of New York. Last year, there were 335. This past February was the safest February in modern New York City history. It was promptly followed by the safest month of March. If that's soft on crime, I'll take it. Attorney General Sessions tried to back off of some of the harsh comments about New York, but only after fierce criticism from the mayor, the police commissioner, and others. The larger issue, more important than a single uninformed letter, is that the Trump administration, starting with the president, traffics in lies and falsehoods about matters large and small. It's both sorrowful and dangerous when the American public cannot trust official pronouncements from its own government. That's all for now. See you next time.